Economies continue to reopen across the U.S. Many people are leaving behind their urban dwellings and heading for the suburbs. This is according to a new op-ed from the Wall Street Journal editorial board. Joining us now is Charlie Hurd, a Fox News contributor and Washington Times opinion editor. So I want to quote some of the numbers here because we have been reporting on this quite a bit, and we've seen this surge out to the suburbs really bump upwards. And if you look at the zip codes that are considered vacations, so it would be Naples and Long Island, they've seen a 30 to 40% jump in sales in this 4-week period versus last year, where the cities have seen quite the opposite. What do you make of this exodus?
Well, if you think about it, Melissa, it kind of makes sense. It's been sort of the perfect storm for that kind of thing to happen. You know, obviously with the pandemic, social distancing is a lot easier when you've got a little bit more space than you have there in Manhattan. And then you add on top of it the fact that you have this stuff that's going on in the streets these days, which is absolutely terrifying. It has to be terrifying for people, especially with families who live in big cities. It makes perfect sense that when you get out of those cities and then even farther beyond the suburbs, when you get into you know, more rural states like South Carolina or Virginia or North Carolina, I think we're going to see a lot of real estate moving in places like that as well.
Yeah. One thing that's different versus the last recession, so you look at, you know, the financial crisis, and in 2010, we saw that urban areas grew at 18% versus the suburbs. So what Wall Street Journal is saying is that there were a lot of young people who then, as the economy, you know, was starting to rebound but was still hurting, they moved to cities like San Francisco and New York in order to find jobs. And now exactly the opposite is happening. The suburbs right now are growing, even with young people, at twice the rate of the cities, as we see this recession maybe bottom and rebound. We hope, but we don't know for sure that's what's going on. But
Sure.
Right now, it's the suburbs that are growing at twice the rate. Do you think, are people finding jobs there, or are they just finding refuge?
Well, I think that they're just finding refuge is the main thing, because, of course, no matter what anybody ever tells you, security is always the #1 thing for families. But the other thing that's going on here is that much like we saw after 9/11, you're seeing this influx of technologies that allows people to telecommute, to work over the internet tubes, and assuming that you have good discipline and you can sit at home and you can do that kind of thing, it turns out that it's actually very, very effective. It's very cost effective. Actually, it's funny that that this should come up, because I would imagine that we would see a lot of companies sort of move in that direction. I've always believed, as someone who has covered Washington for 20 years, I would love to see the federal government take a page out of the playbook of private companies and figure out how to move some of these behemoth agencies in Washington and move them to Nebraska, move them to North Dakota, bring jobs and population with them, and it would be a win-win, and it would also ensure that people who aren't sort of infected with Potomac fever and you know, people outside of the swamp are actually working in the federal government, which would be a very good thing.
That is a fascinating idea, and I haven't thought of it that way before in terms of the government. I mean, I've thought about it in other companies, but if you spread it out, you would get a totally different type of worker, and it might change the way our bureaucracy works. That's fascinating. I wonder, Charlie, is there any way that these big cities aren't screwed, to say it in such blunt terms? When you look at New York and you just look at, they're going to have no money. I mean, this government was already, the state of New York, $7 billion behind the 8 ball this year before the coronavirus. Now they're about 15 billion. People are fleeing. They're not going to get the tax revenue from either the sales tax or the property tax or the income tax. And all the big cities, LA looks like that, Chicago looks like that as people leave. Is there any way out for them other than, I guess, going bankrupt and having to bring in mayors and, you know, fiscal conservators who are better with money and smarter about taxation, all that kind of stuff?
There's no doubt it's going to be ugly, I think, for a lot of those big cities and the more urban states. The other thing, though, obviously putting aside all of these macro problems you have, when I look at the sort of micro problems, like how people get along with one another, it's kind of amazing. In a town like the town I'm from, town of 1,200 people, where people have grown tobacco since the beginning of the country, you kind of have to learn to get along with one another. And when people around here, they look at these images on television of people burning storefronts and smashing windows and torching police cars, people around here, they can't comprehend it. And one of the reasons is because if you live in a smaller town, if you live in some of these suburban places, you have to learn to get along with. It's like living in a big family. You may not want to get along, but you don't have a choice. So you kind of learn to get along, and you learn to work with one another. And I think all of that begins to look more and more appealing if you're in this current environment.
Charlie, you just made at least two really fascinating points that I haven't heard before on this topic. Thank you for coming on and sharing your wisdom today. You give us a lot to think about. We appreciate it. Connell, over to you.